John Marlowe watched in horror as Whiskers, his beloved ferret, slipped through the bars of his carrier and darted into the shadows of the alien spaceship's corridor. His heart raced. This was supposed to be a goodwill mission, a chance to showcase human culture to their extraterrestrial allies. Now, it was turning into a nightmare. "Captain Threx," John called out, his voice strained. "We have a situation." Captain Threx, the calm and composed leader of the alien delegation, turned with a raised brow. His silver eyes glinted with curiosity and mild irritation. "What seems to be the problem, Mr. Marlowe?" "My ferret," John began, swallowing hard, "has escaped. He's harmless, just curious. But he can get into tight spaces and, well, 'cause a bit of trouble." Threx's gaze shifted to the open carrier and then back to John. "A bit of trouble?" he repeated, his tone skeptical. "Your pet has already disabled our lighting system." John cringed. "We'll find him quickly. I promise." The alien captain sighed, his patience visibly waning. "Very well. But understand, our ship's systems are delicate. Any more disruptions could have serious consequences." Determined, John rallied his fellow delegates, Maria and Alex. Maria, an expert on alien technology, quickly accessed the ship's internal sensors to track Whiskers. Alex, a cultural anthropologist, used his knowledge of animal behavior to predict the ferret's movements. "He's heading towards the main reactor," Maria reported, her fingers flying over the holographic interface. Her face was lit by the blue glow of the screen, revealing her focused expression. Alex's eyes widened. "If he chews through those cables, we're in serious trouble." John nodded, determination etched on his face. "Let's move." As they hurried through the sleek metallic corridors, the ship's systems began malfunctioning one by one. Doors refused to open, the temperature fluctuated wildly, and the air filled with the faint scent of burning circuits. Panic crept into the edges of John's mind, but he pushed it aside. They had to catch Whiskers. "Over here," Alex shouted, pointing to a ventilation shaft. Tiny claw marks trailed into the darkness. John reached in, his heart pounding, but the ferret was too quick. Whiskers slipped deeper into the bowels of the ship. Suddenly, the ship's main alarms blared, and red lights bathed the corridor in an ominous glow. Threx's voice echoed through the intercom. "Security breach detected. Lockdown in progress." Maria's face paled. "We've lost communication with Earth." John's frustration bubbled over. "We need to get to the reactor, now." They sprinted through the ship, encountering one malfunction after another. Each step brought a new obstacle, a jammed door, a flickering light, a sudden drop in oxygen levels. But John's determination never wavered. He knew Whiskers was just as scared and confused as they were. Finally, they reached the reactor room. The heat was intense, and the air hummed with the sound of machinery. There, in the corner, was Whiskers, nibbling on a thick bundle of cables. "Whiskers, no!" John shouted, his voice a mix of relief and desperation. The ferret looked up, startled, and darted further into the tangle of wires. John lunged, but just as his fingers grazed Whiskers' fur, the ship shuddered violently. The reactor's alarm screamed louder, signaling imminent meltdown. Captain Threx's voice crackled through the intercom, tinged with urgency. "Mr. Marlowe, if you don't catch that creature now, we all perish." John took a deep breath, his mind racing for a solution. The fate of everyone on board hung in the balance, and time was running out. The spaceship's corridors pulsed with an eerie red glow as the emergency lights flickered. John Marlowe, beads of sweat forming on his brow, glanced at the alien Captain Threx. The captain's normally calm expression was now a mask of frustration. "Where did you last see him?" Threx asked, his voice tight with controlled exasperation. "Near the control room," John replied, his eyes darting nervously around the sterile metallic hallway. "Whiskers slipped away while we were examining your navigation systems." Threx sighed, his antennae twitching. "We must retrieve him before he causes any more damage." Maria, the tech-savvy delegate, approached with a handheld scanner. "I've got a signal," she said, her voice tinged with urgency. "He's moving fast, heading towards the main reactor." Alex, the cultural anthropologist, frowned. if he gets into the reactor. John didn't let him finish. We need to hurry. He took off down the corridor, the others close behind. The ship's automated systems tried to compensate for the damage Whiskers had caused. Doors hissed open and shut, their movements erratic, while the intercom buzzed with static. As they ran, John couldn't help but think about how much Whiskers meant to him. That Ferret had been his companion through thick and thin, a reminder of home and normalcy amidst the chaos of interstellar diplomacy. They reached a junction where the ship's layout became more complex, wires and panels exposed from Whiskers' previous escapades. Maria knelt beside a severed cable, her eyes widening. He's chewed through the main communication line. We're cut off from Earth. Threx clenched his fists. Your pet is remarkably destructive. John's face flushed with embarrassment and worry. He's just curious. We'll fix it, I promise. They continued, the tension mounting with each step. The hum of the reactor grew louder, a constant reminder of the ticking clock they were racing against. Maria's scanner beeped rapidly as they neared the reactor room. He's just ahead. John's heart pounded as they entered the room. The reactor, a massive structure of gleaming metal and pulsing energy, dominated the space. And there, atop the main power conduit, was Whiskers, his tiny teeth gnawing on a critical wire. Whiskers! John shouted, his voice echoing off the metallic walls. The Ferret looked up, momentarily distracted, and in that split second, the wire he had been chewing snapped. The reactor's hum turned into a high-pitched whine, and alarms began blaring throughout the ship. Threx's eyes widened in horror. He's destabilized the core. We need to shut it down manually. John sprinted forward, his hands trembling as he carefully approached Whiskers. Easy, boy, he murmured. Come to me. Whiskers, sensing the urgency in John's voice, hesitated, then scurried into his arms. With a sigh of relief, John cradled the Ferret close. Maria was already at the control panel, her fingers flying over the holographic interface. I can stabilize it, but I need time. Threx nodded, his usual composure returning. Do it. John, get Whiskers out of here. John didn't need to be told twice. As he turned to leave, he cast a worried glance back at the reactor, where Maria and Threx worked frantically to avert disaster. Just as he reached the door, the ship shuddered violently and the lights flickered again. A new alarm blared, louder and more urgent than before. We've got another problem, Alex said, his voice barely audible over the din. The ship's sensors are detecting an incoming asteroid storm. John Marlowe's heart pounded as he sprinted through the labyrinthine corridors of the alien spaceship. The normally serene environment was now a chaotic mess of flashing lights and blaring alarms. Whiskers, his elusive ferret, had managed to find his way into the most sensitive areas of the ship, causing disruptions at every turn. Where is he now? John called out, glancing back at Maria, who was furiously tapping on her handheld device. Near the reactor room, Maria replied, her voice strained with urgency. If he chews through those cables, we could have a meltdown on our hands. John cursed under his breath and quickened his pace. Beside him, Captain Threx maintained a stoic expression, though his eyes betrayed a growing concern. This mission, intended to foster goodwill between species, had turned into a potential disaster, all thanks to a small, curious creature. Your persistence is admirable, John, Threx said, his voice a controlled monotone. But if we don't catch him soon, the consequences could be catastrophic. I know, John replied, determination etched on his face. I won't let that happen. Whiskers means too much to me. The team rounded a corner and entered the reactor room, the heat hitting them like a wall. Whiskers was there, gnawing on the reactor's main power conduit. Sparks flew as the cable began to fray, and the room's alarms intensified, indicating a critical situation. John took a deep breath and approached slowly, trying not to startle the Ferret. Whiskers, come here, buddy, he called softly, extending his hand. It's time to go home. Whiskers paused, his tiny body quivering with tension. For a moment, it seemed as if he might come to John, but then a loud clang echoed through the room as a panel fell loose, startling the Ferret. He darted further into the tangle of cables and machinery. He's going to bring down the whole ship, Maria exclaimed, her eyes wide with fear. John didn't hesitate. He dropped to his knees and crawled into the maze of wires, ignoring the searing pain as electrical sparks burned his skin. His only focus was on Whiskers, who was now dangerously close to the reactor core. Captain Threx and Maria watched helplessly as John maneuvered through the hazardous area. "We can't let him do this alone," Threx said, finally breaking his stoic demeanor. "Maria, find a way to deactivate the alarms. We need to reduce the noise and calm the ferret." Maria nodded and hurried to a control panel, her fingers flying over the keys. Within moments, the blaring alarms quieted, leaving only the hum of the reactor and John's labored breathing. John reached out slowly, his hand trembling as he inched closer to Whiskers. "It's okay, boy," he whispered. "I'm right here." With a final, desperate lunge, John grabbed Whiskers and pulled him to safety. He cradled the ferret in his arms, feeling the tiny heart beating rapidly against his chest. Just as he began to relax, a new alarm sounded. John's eyes darted to the reactor's control panel, which was flashing a dire warning. The reactor's temperature was rising rapidly, heading towards a meltdown. "We need to fix this now," Threx shouted, his voice commanding. "Maria, reroute the power. John, stay with Whiskers and get out of there." As John turned to escape, he caught a glimpse of the reactor's core starting to glow an ominous red. He bolted towards the exit, clutching Whiskers tightly. The corridor behind him began to rumble, hinting at the impending disaster. They burst into the main hall, where the rest of the crew and delegates were frantically working to stabilize the ship. John handed Whiskers to a startled crew member and joined Threx and Maria at the main control panel. Together, they worked furiously to divert the ship's energy and cool the reactor. "We're almost there," Maria said, her voice filled with both hope and fear. The reactor's temperature gauge slowly began to drop, but not quickly enough. Just as it seemed they might succeed, the ship shuddered violently, knocking them off their feet. John's heart pounded as he sprinted towards the reactor room, the ship's alarms blaring incessantly. Whiskers, now a symbol of chaos and innocence, had chewed through the main power conduit, causing the reactor to overheat. The alien crew and human delegates were close behind, their faces a mix of determination and fear. "John, we have to get him out of there before it's too late," Maria shouted, her voice barely audible over the cacophony of alarms and the hum of the overheating reactor. Captain Threx, usually composed and stoic, was visibly shaken. His normally unflappable demeanor had been replaced by a sense of urgency. "If the reactor melts down, we're all doomed," he said, his voice laced with a rare hint of desperation. John nodded, his eyes locked on the small, furry figure gnawing at the exposed wires. "Whiskers, come here, buddy," he called, trying to keep his voice steady despite the rising panic within him. Whiskers paused, his tiny head tilting as if considering John's plea. But before he could make a move, a loud hiss erupted from the reactor, sending a wave of scorching heat through the room. The ship's systems began to falter, lights flickering and air growing thin. "There's no time," Alex said, grabbing a fire extinguisher from the wall. "We need to act now." John took a deep breath, his mind racing. He couldn't let his beloved pet cause such destruction, but he also couldn't abandon him. Summoning all his courage, he lunged forward, grabbing Whiskers just as another hiss of steam filled the room. "I've got him!" John shouted, cradling Whiskers against his chest. The ferret squirmed but didn't resist, perhaps sensing the gravity of the situation. Captain Threx and Maria rushed to the control panel, working in unison to stabilize the reactor. Sparks flew as they reconnected the severed cables, their movements precise and urgent. Alex doused the overheating components with the fire extinguisher, cooling the reactor enough to buy them precious seconds. The ship shuddered, a violent tremor running through its hull. John held Whiskers tightly, feeling the ferret's rapid heartbeat against his own. "Please, let this work," he whispered, watching as Threx and Maria's hands moved with practiced efficiency. Finally, the alarms began to subside, and the reactor's hum lowered to a steady, manageable level. The lights stabilized, and the oppressive heat began to dissipate. Captain Threx exhaled a long breath, his composure slowly returning. "We did it," Maria said, a relieved smile spreading across her face. John looked down at Whiskers, who who was now calmly nestled in his arms. "You're quite the troublemaker, aren't you?" he said softly, a mix of exasperation and affection in his voice. Threx approached John, his expression a blend of respect and residual frustration. "Your ferret caused a great deal of chaos, John, but your quick thinking saved us all. I must admit, I underestimated both of you." John smiled, feeling a sense of camaraderie with the alien captain. "Thank you, Captain. We'll help repair the damage and ensure this doesn't happen again." As they worked together to repair the ship, a new alarm sounded, its tone ominous and urgent. "Incoming asteroid storm," Threx announced, his eyes widening in surprise. "We must navigate through it immediately." John, Maria, and Alex exchanged determined glances. "Let's get to the bridge," John said. "We can handle this together."